How many of you came to Nashville prior to 1980? One, two, three of you. Okay. I started coming here in 1969. I was managing a little band called the Beach Boys. We had a record distribution deal to start a King for a group called The Flame. Now, The Flame were a group from Durban, South Africa. They were produced by my dear friend of 35 plus years, Carl Wilson, one of the founding members of the Beach Boys and probably one of the greatest lead singers in the history of rock and roll. It was a different time. The high rise was the LNC Tower down on 4th Avenue. You could, for $1 or $1.50, you could go up on the 14th floor and go out on their observation deck, kind of like the Statue of Liberty, except about 75 floors shorter. This was a different town back then. There were a handful of labels, maybe 6 or 7. It was still, a fun town to be in. The Grand Ole Opry was at the Ryman and would be for the next 4 or 5 years. And I always looked forward to coming to Nashville. I had a few friends in country music, including the great Hank Snow, and he would always invite me to the Opry when I came in from LA. And I would go backstage and he would show me into the men's dressing room. They had a men's dressing room on stage right, and they had a women's dressing room on stage left. And it was just it was half the size of this room. And there was mirrors all around the left wall, and there were hat racks and coat racks along the right wall. There were some folding chairs, and underneath the mirror was a long shelf where you could put your makeup and cigarettes and your hairspray. Everybody used hairspray back then. And here I am walking into this room. The long-haired hippie guy from California. My hair was longer than it is now. My wife gets after me for being it this long, but it was over my shoulders. And here I am, and Hank introduces me to Stoney Cooper is smoking a cigarette, and Haycup is tuning his fiddle, and Ernest Tubb is polishing his boots, and it's like, what am I doing in this room? These are my heroes, But that's the way it was. It wasn't like it is after the class of 1989, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. This was a small, big town, or a big, small town, whichever way you want to look at it. And it was a great city, and it was fun, and it was not as political as it is now. And there were no gatekeepers like there are now. I mean, I could sit down with Chad or Jim Vogelsong of ABC Dot at the time, and he would later move on to Capitol and MCA and put in about 10 or 15 members into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, from Barbara Mandrell and the Oak Ridge Boys to Garth Brooks to Reba to Vince to Don Williams. He was my mentor, he was my hero, and I'd sit down and chat with him. It was a whole different town. 16th Avenue was a 2-lane street. And I moved here in 74, so by 74 to 80, it started to see some activity. The BMI offices were here. This was the big conference room. And in 1981, 82, I was on the Board of Governors for the Recording Academy, NARAS, and I was vice president of the Nashville chapter. And this is where we would meet every month, right here. And Joe Muscayo, who was the president under my term, is gone, deceased. Glenn Snoddy, who started the great Woodland Recording Studio over at East Nashville, was on the board, and he's deceased. I mean, there was an old song back in the 30s and 40s called "Those Wedding Bells Are Breaking Up the Old Gang of Mine." That was the name of the song. One of those Tin Pan Alley songs, pre-built grill building. And now, unfortunately, age and illness is breaking up so many friends. I mean, I've lost 5 in the last 4 or 5 months. DJ Fontana, Elvis's drummer, is gone. Freddie Hart, who I got to work with at Capitol, is gone. And we lost the great Harold Bradley on January 31st, who was my dear friend and probably the most recorded musician in the history of Nashville. We've lost Fred Foster, who started Monument Records, signed Dolly, signed Christopherson, I mean, just an incredible gentleman. We just lost him a few weeks ago. So, you know, this room brings back memories, you know, and this is before Francis Preston moved BMI from New York to Nashville. And that's why you have that giant building that we all entered, that we all walked into because of her. And she was at the top of her game back then. I mean, this is 39, 40 years ago, 38 anyway. So it brings back memories here, and for those of you that weren't around to see that old Nashville, you know, it's one of those things that I can't really explain it other than the fact that it was a great time to be coming to Nashville, whether on business or whether you moved here as I did in 1974. So I was with the Beach Boys twice, once from 63 to 66. I was their advance man, I was their MC. I was a 19-year-old kid when their dad, Murray Wilson, hired me. I set up their concert division. Concerts ended up being their primary income. And we did a lot of shows together, hundreds of shows together. And then I went to work for a company called Teenage Fair in 66, 69. And then the Beach Boys had let go of their current manager in 69, and Carl called me, and I was on the road. I was in Denver, Colorado, and Carl said, can you hop on a plane and come out here? We'd like to talk to you about rejoining the group. And of course I couldn't say no, so I left Teenage Fair and actually took a cut in pay. But it was a great time, and it was, you know, an exciting era. They were just shifting labels from Capitol, where they'd been for over 7 years, to Warner Brothers. But at Warner's, they were the new kids on the block. At Capitol, they had a catalog. Capitol never forgot the Beach Boys because they had their entire catalog. Whereas at Warner Brothers, they were a new group, and they were competing with, you know, people like James Taylor and you know, all these groups that were left of center that had been big on the, you know, the Woodstock and all the live shows, all the you know, shed shows, etc., etc. So it was a different time. So after I left the Boys in 71, I went to work for Capitol because I knew everybody there, and it was exciting to be at a label where, you know, you could promote things, and it was great music, and they all had melodies, and they all had lyrics you didn't have to explain to your kids, which was great. And I was there, and then I went from Capitol to RCA, and I was in the right label at the right time in both cases. You know, at Capitol, I got to work with, you know, one of my heroes, Buck Owens, and I got to work with Hag, and, you know, it was a great time. Glenn Campbell, who I booked back in the 1960s, and it was a great time to be at Capitol. But when I went into RCA, then I got to work with John Denver, and I got to promote Elvis, and I got to promote, you know, Charlie Pride, and some of the great stable of acts at RCA Victor at the time. And one of them was a guy named Waylon Jennings. And I can honestly say that Waylon was Nashville's first rebel. He was the first renegade. He was the first maverick. You know, he wanted to do it his way. And he didn't like being put into a cage by the executives at RCA. So when I would work with Waylon on the road, you know, he said, Fred, at some point you're going to probably leave Nipper. He said, and if you do, you come see me first. And I did. I left Nipper in, around February of 74, came to Nashville around April and saw Waylon. He had just set up a publishing company with Tom Paul Glazer over on 18th Avenue. They had a studio upstairs and the Glazer Publishing Company downstairs. And Waylon said, well, Fred, I can't give you a lot of money, but I can give you a telephone and a desk. And as long as you promote my stuff, you know, you can take on other accounts and it'll be all right. And so I took the gig, and soon I started, you know, bringing in other accounts, Clapton and RSO Records and John Travolta, Olivia Newton-John, Grease soundtrack, and George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic, and the great Jimmy Dean, GRT, and Mel Street, bless his soul, who was a great country singer, took his own life. Ronnie McDowell, The King is gone, great single, gold record. So I was doing independent. We had a group, Alabama, that we couldn't launch. You know, we bombed with Alabama. We got them exposed, but we couldn't bring them home. And then they went to RCA, and you know how that turned out. So it was a great time. Again, 16th Avenue was starting to get businesses on 16th Ave. We had a few studios, but it was an exciting time, mainly because of the access. You know, you could get in and see the people, and you could get decisions out of them without it taking 6 or 8 weeks if you're lucky or more. So it was a great time to be here. So in 1980, I was pretty well burnt out on what I call dial and smile, calling radio stations, going out on the road visiting radio stations, trying to get them to add records. A friend of mine, Dave Shipley, was a studio musician, but he wasn't the A team, he was like the B team. So he wasn't getting all the great stars, he was doing demos and spec sessions and stuff like that. So he and I decided to get into the studio business, and there was a little studio on 17th Avenue, 49 East Square West, which is the old 17th Avenue. And it was owned by two brothers, the Ritchie brothers. Paul was a music publisher, George was a record producer, and George's wife was the great Tammy Wynette. So they were great producers and great managers and great publishers, but they were horrible studio managers. And the building was getting ready to evict them, and the Commerce Union Bank, which is now Bank of America, was getting ready to call their loan, and they'd already started to sell off some of their equipment, including the 24-track analog machine. And Dave and I worked a deal out to cash them out and take over their equipment, take over their lease. And we thought we'd be there for at least 3 or 4 years, get it off the ground, get it going, build up a good clientele. And then we moved to Berry Hill, where we had purchased a house for $28,000 in 1979. And it was, like I said, it was a pretty good time. So we were hard at work, and Jones came in, he was one of our clients, and we had some, George, we had some great times, but they informed us that they weren't going to be able to renew our lease. And we had about 3 months remaining on it, and we just assumed it was automatic. There was still empty space in the building, and we just assumed that they'd renew our lease at the end of the lease, but they said they couldn't because they had the opportunity to lease 6,000 square feet of additional space next to us, 2-story area that was unfinished. It was just cement floors and stud walls. And this guy was going to build a state-of-the-art, world-class studio for his son that had a little home studio in Antioch. And we said, well, when are they coming in? They said, well, they're going to come in, this is like Wednesday. They said, we're going to come in Monday, and they're going to start doing demolition. And I said, well, they're right on the other side of the wall. I've got a studio, I've got sessions. I said, if they want to come in at midnight and work till 8 in the morning, that's fine. Or if they want to come in when I'm not booked, that's fine. Or the weekend, if I'm not booked, that's fine. But until they, until I'm out, which is roughly 4 months, I'm going to want my privacy. I'm going to want my space. I'm going to want my silence. I'm going to, I'm selling sound. You can't do that with jackhammers going off and buzzsaws and swearing carpenters. The three don't mix, right? So I knew what would happen, and I knew the guy that was going to build this state-of-the-art studio, which in 1981 probably would have been about a $500,000 investment, roughly, in 81. So if you go 4 to 6 times that, this was going to be a $4 to $6 million venture in today's dollars. So I kind of knew I had the upper hand, and I told the manager, who was a really nice guy, by the way, the manager of the building, I told him, that I'm going to hire an attorney and get an injunction and shut them down until the end of my lease. And he knew I could do that. So I just waited for the phone to ring, and after he went upstairs, and sure enough, he calls me up and he said, Fred, we got to have a talk. I said, we've gone back to the people that are taking over that studio next to you, and they don't want to wait 4 months, and basically, what's it going to take to get you to go silently into the night? And I'd already figured that out. I knew exactly what I wanted. In retrospect, not enough, but at the time it was a good deal. I said, well, I want you to give me a month to get all my existing clients off the books, no interruptions, I can operate anytime I want. I want you to store my equipment until I have a new home for it, and I want $35,000. And he said, you got it. So with that $35,000, the equipment and storage, A month later, we moved out to Berry Hill, and 54 weeks later, on September 22nd, 1982, we reemerged as Treasure Isle Recorders. That was our Berry Hill studio, which we now have. We are the third oldest studio in Nashville that's still under its original ownership and management. There are some great studios that are as old as us, or older, like Woodland, but they've been bought and sold and leased and closed by the health department and bankrupt, etc., several times, and we're still chucking away. The two above me, the two oldest, the first oldest is Wayne Moss, Cinderella Sound Studio in Madison. It's been around since 1961. Still, you know, Wayne is still there and answers the phone. You know, just like me, I answer the phone at Treasure Isle. The second oldest studio is only 2 doors north of me, believe it or not. Buzz Casing Creative Workshop, 2804 Azalea. Buzz and I have become good friends, and Buzz, I call Buzz the dean of the Berry Hill Studios. He was the first one to recognize that being, 15 short minutes from Music Row and getting out of the tourist stuff, getting out of the high rent district wasn't a bad idea. He came out there in 1970, and Brent Mayer became his partner eventually, and they did publishing interests together, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of, brings you up to date on me and Treasure Isle and my basic background. Love the studio business, love the music business. In 1957, when RCOB, I was a 13-year-old kid, and I was working as a gopher on a radio station. I interviewed Teen Idol Ricky Nelson on the set of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, and I'd attended my first country music live show at a place called the New Coconut Grove Ballroom. Larry and Becca, have you ever been to the New Coconut Grove Ballroom in South Sacramento? Well, here's this World War II ballroom on the second floor above a laundromat and a drugstore. And we went there, my brother and I, my friend Bob Jones, had my folks take us down there. My brother was 16, Bob and I were 13. We went down, we went up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, there was a little ticket window. And we paid our $1.50, and we went in. And this old ballroom, wood floor, stage at one end, concession stand at the other end, and no fixed seating. There was a few chairs and sofas and little tables around the perimeter, but, no fixed seating. So we ran down to the stage, and we were the only kids there. It was mostly couples in their 20s, 30s. They had gone there to dance. It was a dance hall like Roseland in New York City. So we went down to the stage, and I remember propping my elbows up and looking up, and the curtain opens up, and there's these 3 guys in red blazers. And the guy on the left was playing a stand-up bass, an acoustic bass, what we call a slap bass. And that was Marshall Grant. The guy on the right was playing a Fender Tele off of a little amplifier on the store, and that was Luther Perkins. And the guy in the middle with the Tennessee flat-top box was a guy named Johnny Cash. And that was my introduction to country music in 1957. And he was doing all the Sun stuff. Rock Island Line, Give Me Love a Rose, Cry, 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 Ballad of a Teenage Queen, all these great songs. No drummer, no June Carter, just Johnny Cash and the Tennessee Two. And that's all they needed. This was magical. So I met Cash after the show. I got him to sign his Sun 45. I still have it. One of my most cherished possessions. And if I pass away, I hope my dear wife Debbie here, my wife Debbie, doesn't put it on eBay and give it away for free. along with my 6,000 albums and singles, many of them signed, and put them on a yard sale for 25 cents. I hope that doesn't happen. Thank God it won't. But what makes the story so cool, so complete, and why I've been so blessed to have worked with my heroes, is the fact that 25 years later, the Man in Black, the member of the Country Music Hall of Fame, the iconic Johnny Cash, is in Treasure Isle recording an album with Mark Stewart, the gospel album. Don't get much better than that. So since 1980, when we started Island Recorders, which evolved into Treasure Island Recorders, we recorded somewhere between 50 and 75 members of the rock and roll Country Music, Gospel, and Songwriters Hall of Fame. I tell people it's easier for me to recite the people that haven't recorded there than it is the ones that have. But of the ones that have, obviously, the great Johnny Cash, Emmylou, Linda Ronstadt, the Beach Boys, Sting, from the Bridge Group, the Police. Waylon did his last studio album at my studio. How ironic is that? He did his last album at my studio. Michael W. Smith, Sandy Patty, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Jars of Clay, B.B. King, Isaac Hayes. We just had James Taylor in a month ago for his second project at our studio. The Byrds, Hillman and Crosby and McGuinn. Dolly's done 2 albums there. Skaggs has done 3 albums there. Of course, now we're known as the studio home of Michael Knox and Jason Aldean. Jason Aldean came here from Macon, arrived about 2000. Met Michael, was signed to an artist development deal at Warner Chappell. At some point around 2003-ish, Michael left Warner Chappell, took Jason with him, made the rounds of the labels, was turned down by several, and finally it landed at Broken Bow. And they'd been doing their demos at my place, and they didn't think there was any reason to rock the boat, so when he got his contract, he started recording his albums. We've done all 8 of his albums, roughly 36 million singles and album sales. Between 21 and 25 #1 records. All the albums are platinum. The 2005 My Kind of Party is now 4 times platinum, had 5 #1 singles. The new album is in progress. He was at the studio about 2 weeks ago working on that, and that'll be album number 9. So we've been a major part of his success, and his sound is our sound, the Treasure House sound, which I don't know if any of you guys are into women or into audio, if you've ever heard of a guy named George Massenburg. George is probably one of the most rewarded engineer producers in the music industry. I mean, massive artists that he's worked with over the years, and he recently, not too recently, it's probably been 5 years now, he left Nashville and went to Canada. His wife's Canadian, and he's now teaching at McGill University in Toronto. And he left because he said the labels weren't giving him adequate budgets to do great albums anymore. And he wasn't going to do second-rate, inferior product. So he left, But, before he left, he had made the comment that Treasure Isle is simply the best live tracking room in Nashville. That was his quote. I'm very proud of that because it is all about the sound. I mean, what we're selling now, to me, it hasn't changed since I was a kid listening to the little transistor radio, the Japanese transistor radio, with a little earbud in my ear, and I put it under the pillow so my folks couldn't hear me at night. When I should be asleep, I'd be listening to a radio station in San Francisco or in Sacramento and listening to all the great rock and roll music that was coming out of that era. And, it's the same thing then, and it's the same thing now. Everything starts with a great song, and a great song and a great lead singer is the bottom line. That's the bottom line. Great vocals, great song. Haven't changed much. Right now we're being inundated with a lot of hip hop, a lot of loops. Everything kind of sounds the same. But at the same time, you got to move forward. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the Nashville studio scene. Prior to Nashville becoming a studio mecca, most of the records that were country records, well, most of the records in general, country or pop or jazz, were recorded in either Atlanta, Georgia, Camden, New Jersey, New York City, Chicago, or Los Angeles. There was a studio in Dallas, there was a studio in San Antonio. There were a few scattered studios, but the main studios were located in those cities. Nashville did not have a recording studio until 70 years after Thomas Alva Edison created the cylinder disc player. This is an interesting story right here. I'm going to pass it around. You guys can take a look at it. I used to speak, when my daughter was a student at Page Junior High, Page Middle School, and Page High School, I would speak to the music students, the choir, the music students, the band, etc., etc. And I would always go around the room during the class, and I would have them tell me, how many songs do you have on your iPod or handheld device? And some of them would say, 100, 80, 200, 300, 400, 500. And I remember this one young man said he had over 2,000 songs on his iPod. 2,000. And I told him, I hope you paid for most of those. But chances are he didn't. So then I held up that little cylinder and I said, how would you like to carry 2,000 of these around in your backpack? That's what music was like in the teens and early 20s, cylinder. When Nashville started, now let's go back right before Nashville. How many of you have heard of the Bristol Sessions? The Bristol Sessions of 1927. Johnny Cash would refer to the Bristol Sessions of 1927 as the Big Bang of country music. Ralph Peer, a music publisher and an executive of the RCA Victor Bluebird Recording Company, would go out on the road with portable equipment, and he would record people in churches and in living rooms or parlors. And in this case, in 1927, he went to Bristol, Tennessee, and took over an old warehouse, set up his portable equipment, and recorded 72 tracks or sides or songs over a 5-day period in August of 1927. Out of those Bristol Sessions became 3 members of the Country Music Hall of Fame. His mother-in-law, Maybelle Carter, and the Carter family, A.P., Sarah, and Maybelle. Doc Stoneman and the Stoneman family, a traditional mountain band. And of course, the great Jimmy Rogers, the father of country music. The guy that inspired most of the country music performers in the first half of the 20th century. Hank Snow, Ernest Tubb, their hero was Jimmy Rogers. Now the hero is Garth Brooks, or Vince Gill, or Dan and Shay, or whatever the current flavor of the month is. That's who the heroes are. So it wasn't until, well, what they did back in those days, by the way, before we had a studio industry here, they recorded at WSM Radio. WSM Radio was 1925. The Opry went on the air in 1925. Any of you ever heard of Edwin Craig? Edwin Craig. Well, there's about 120 people in the Country Music Hall of Fame. A few more if you include duets, trios, and groups. But there's no Edwin Craig on the wall. And that's a real travesty, because Edwin Craig is the reason everybody in this room is in Nashville, Tennessee. Every one of you, without exception. Because Edwin Craig was away at college on the East Coast, and he came back and told his dad, who was president of the National Life and Accident Insurance Company, we need a radio station in Nashville. And his dad said, okay, do the research and let's get a radio station. So they started WSM Radio. WSM stands for We Shield Millions, which is the slogan of the National Life and Accident Insurance Company. And then they needed programming. Yeah, there was a lot of live feeds from New York, Chicago, but they wanted to have a local program and feature local and regional entertainment. So Edwin Craig comes up with this idea called the WSM Barn Dance, which evolves into the Grand Ole Opry. And there's an old saying in economics and politics, it's called follow the money. In this case, follow the Opry. That's the reason why we are all here. Directly or indirectly, the Grand Ole Opry contributed to the birth of Music City, USA. And Edwin Craig is still lacking in the walls of the rotunda on the second floor of the Country Music Hall of Fame. That's a tragedy. Total tragedy. There's a guy named Irving Waugh. How many of you ever heard of Irving Waugh? You're doing good. Irving Waugh was a salesman at WSM Radio. It's his idea to sell advertising. When a little organization in 1959 started called the Country Music Association, Irving Waugh got involved. He and Joe Walker, before she was Joe Walker, met her. When membership was $10. I was a 17-year-old kid. I was summer of 1961. I was making $1.50, $2 an hour as a program director and midday DJ at a country music FM radio station in Sacramento. And I couldn't afford the life membership to the Country Music Association, which was $100 for a lifetime. But I did buy a yearly membership for $10. And my membership card was signed by Gene Autry. Pretty amazing. So this whole thing, started with music being recorded at WSM Radio. And one of the big hits of 1946, I'll pass this around. One of the big hits of 1946 was a song called Near You, Francis Craig. Yeah, World War II had ended, and the GIs had returned home from the Pacific Theater and the European Theater. They were starting to raise families. They were settling in Berry Hill, which was a housing project near the bomber plant on Riley Parkway. And Francis Craig, who had a society band at the Hermitage Hotel, he co-wrote a song called Near You. And the whole idea of the song was, I'm tired of war, I'm tired of being away. All I want to do is spend the rest of my life near you. And they recorded it at WSM. And it became Nashville's first million-selling #1 record. It was #1 for 17 weeks in 1946 and 47. And it was the Cashbox and Billboard Record of the Year. So Nashville's first million seller, first #1, was not a country record. It was a pop record with Francis Craig and his orchestra. About the same time, 1946, 3 engineers that worked at WSM Radio on the Opry and at the radio station in downtown Nashville decided to moonlight. They took over a portion of the ballroom at the Tulane Hotel, and they set up a little recording studio. And they recorded the great Hank Williams there, the father, along with a lot of other artists of the era. And it was early. I mean, you're talking about 70 years after after Thomas Edison had, invented the cylinder disc. And it was, but we were slow at that point. Nashville was kind of slow to get on the scene. It was, it didn't have a studio, but now it had a studio. And they were running it out of the Tulane Hotel ballroom, and they were starting to miss work. And the head of WSM programming went to them and said, hey, listen, you guys are spending too much time on your hobby, on your moonlighting, and you're not taking care of business at WSM, and we're going to give you an ultimatum. You can keep your day job and your paycheck and your benefits and close down your studio, or you can keep the studio, but don't let the door hit you on the way out. And they took the paycheck. They closed the studio. And it was another few years, almost 7 years, before 2 guys came to Nashville, the Bradley brothers, Owen and Harold. They bought an old house over on 16th Avenue, residential area, street going north and south. It became the first studio on Music Row. At some point, they outgrew the house. They opened up a studio in the rear. They bought an old surplus Quonset hut, set it up out on the back side of the house, and that became the Quonset hut studio, which was a bigger room, and they could do bigger bands and etc. And they could get a better sound. And that became, they shortened it to the hut, so that became the hut. And then in about the same time, the Methodist Sunday School Board opened up a studio over between 15th and 16th and McGavick, right behind Beeman, Pontiac GMC Toyota. And they built a studio there called the Trafco Studio. And the Trafco Studio, they did a lot of preachers, sermons, and gospel quartets, and choirs and all that. But when they had time, they would let record label people come in and rent the studio. And that happened on January 10th of 1956. A young kid named Elvis Presley went into the Trafco studio and recorded Heartbreak Hotel, Mayborn Accident. It was his first home run. His Sun records had not charted on the pop charts. They'd gotten primarily country play. This was a home run. This went to #1 Billboard and Catchbox. This started his career. So Steve Scholz, who had signed Elvis, had paid Sam Phillips a reported $35,000 for that contract, decided that Nashville, it'd be cool to have a studio in Nashville, for RCA to have a studio. How many of you seen Field of Dreams, the movie Field of Dreams? I bet every one of you knows the key line in that movie. What is it? If you build it, they will come. Well, basically, Steve Scholz and his assistant, a guy named Chet Atkins, guitar player, basically went to New York and said, listen, we need a studio in Nashville, and if you let us build it, he will come. Meaning Elvis. And Elvis loved recording in Nashville. It was his people. He born in Tupelo, Mississippi, grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. These were his people. He was comfortable here. He liked the laid-back environment. He didn't like the hustle and bustle in New York City or LA where he'd been recording. So in 1957, they opened up RCA Studio B. How many of you have been to RCA Studio B and taken a tour of RCA Studio B? About, 6 of you maybe? It's well worth your time. You remind me, Bob, and I will call up Justin Croft, the manager, and maybe at some point in the future, we could have a meeting there, and I could take you through it and give you the history of B. It's gonna probably have to pay a little bit. I'll try to get a group rate because it's an attraction, and now they take you over on little buses from the Country Music Hall of Fame. I think it's around $16, $17 bucks.
The piano's still there,
the Elvis piano, the Steinway, is still there. The one that Floyd Kramer played Last Date on, and Please Help Me, I'm Falling, and so many memories. That studio is much like it was when Elvis left the building. They rebuilt the Quonset hut over on 16th. It's not the same. It's been completely gutted. It had been office space for years for Columbia Records. They couldn't bring it back to its old self, the curved ceiling and all that. The barn wood, shag carpet, they didn't bother to reproduce that. But RCA Studio B is almost like it was when Elvis walked out the door. He did over 200 singles in that room. Over 1,000 hits have come out of that room. Everybody from the great Hank Snow and Waylon Jennings developed the outlaw sound there. Porter and Dolly. Dolly's great. All of her early hits, Jolene and Coat of Many Colors, a tribute to her mother, and I Will Always Love You, which became her biggest record, thanks to Whitney Houston. All the greats recorded there, including Al Hurt did a jazz record there. I referred to it in the video, Java. It was the jazz instrumental, the Grammy Award winner in '72. Waylon's Only Daddy Will Walk the Line that pretty much started the old cowboy movement. Wanted the Outlaws, Nashville's first platinum album, recorded there with Tom Paul Glaser and Jesse Colder, Waylon's wife, Waylon and Willie. a great album. So you had, RCAB came along, and then, then around 60, 61, you had Cinderella Sound out of Madison. During that same period of time, and getting further into the 60s, early 70s, you had Quadraphonic, or the Quad Studio, recorded Jimmy Buffett, recorded a lot of, Linda Ronstadt, a lot of great artists were recorded there, and that was a great studio. Soundstage came along and recorded a lot of the great artists during the 70s, 80s, including Reba and Strait, and all those were recorded at the Soundstage. After the Soundstage, Woodland came along in between. That was around 1970, Glenn Snoddy, and of course Woodland did Willie Nelson, You Were Always on My Mind, which is considered one of the top 2 or 3 country music records of all time, country music songs of all time. That was Elvis recorded there, a lot of great artists recorded there. Quad was a great little studio. It's still there, by the way. I think it's had 5 owners, but it's still there on 18th and Cross Street.
I think it went private.
I think Roundhill owns it.
Did it? It was on Horton and 18th, I believe. But that's where Jimmy Buffett did Margaritaville was done there, and a lot of great records. Heart of Gold was recorded there. Neil Young, Taylor Swift recorded there. A lot of great artists recorded there, over the years, and it's still there. I mean, it survived. And then, you're into the 70s, 80s, and you've got Treasure Isle starts in 1980 as Island Recorders and changes in 82 to Treasure Isle Recorders. In late 83, we purchased a 32-track 3M digital machine, and we became the first digital multi-track studio in Nashville. That machine, which would make a nice boat anchor now, cost me $125,000 in 1983. And in 1984, we did the first multi-track digital album recorded in Nashville. It was Emmylou Harris, The Ballad of Sally Rose, which is currently being saluted at the Country Music Hall of Fame with an exhibit on Emmylou. And part of it is The Ballad of Sally Rose, which featured Dolly, her buddy from here, and Linda Ronstadt, her buddy from California. The studio thing has always, to me, it's always been the basic tool of the music business. This is where a song and a singer come together in a creative, technical atmosphere with great musicians, arrangers, background singers, and create music, create legacies. That's what a studio's always been. We've seen a lot of changes in the sound. We've gone from mono 1-track to 2-track to 3-track to 4-track to 8-track to 16-track. Then we got into 24-track, and then we got into the digital recording in the 80s, when Studer and 3M Manufacturing and Mitsubishi got into the digital recording scene. But it's always been a creative atmosphere. It's always been that way. And then we get into the modern era with the modern studios. Oh, by the way, when Bradley Brothers started the Quonset Hut in 1955, Owen was the head of A&R for Decca Records. That was his gig. And of course, he recorded all the great Decca acts in his studio. And he recorded Patsy Cline, and he recorded Ernest Tubb and Bill Anderson. He recorded Conway Twitty, the best friend a song ever had. You ever heard that say? Conway Twitty was the best friend a song ever had. A great singer. And then, of course, he discovered and recorded Loretta Lynn. And then in '62, he sold the studio to CBS. So all the CBS acts started to record there. And they recorded 2 Simon & Garfunkel albums that were recorded right here in Nashville. Bob Dylan did 3 albums in Nashville and part of the 4th, including Nashville Skyline, that introduced us to Charlie Daniels and a guy named Charlie McCoy. They were on that album as musicians. So that all came out of George Jones 1980, huge year. 1980 was a huge year for country music. It was also the year that we started Island Recorders. But that one singular year, we had two major motion pictures saluting country music, Urban Cowboy and Coal Miner's Daughter. So all the guys were trading in their cars for pickup trucks and trading in their tennis shoes and loafers for boots, and everybody was wearing a cowboy hat. That was 1980, and then this guy, George Jones, records a Bobby Braddock, Curly Putnam song, You Stop Loving Her Today. That was all 1980, huge year for country music. And then we go through the, through the 80s and, more studios, and then we get into the early 90s, and Blackbird opens up the studio next to me, $23 million capitalized expenditure. They did two studios next to me on Azalea. Then they couldn't buy my studio, and they couldn't buy Buzz's studio, which are on the right and left of their studio. So they went over on Bransford and built 4 more studios. They bought that property from Brent Mayer, a great producer and publisher who produced all the great Judd's albums, Michael Johnson, Bluer Than Blue, and a lot of great records, including one of Elvis's last records. And we started to see, Berry Hill emerge, and Blackbird has certainly been a big part of that growth. But as you may know, ever since 2006, we had 3 things happen in the early 2000s that kind of affected Nashville and the studio business. 2001, unfortunately, was 9/11. Everybody was worried. They were shaking in their boots that there'd be these things happening all the time, terrorist attacks. So the labels started to cut back on signing new talent. Then around 2003, we had file sharing, and that cut into revenue by an estimated 30 to 40%, depending upon who you speak to. So that was a tremendous blow to recording. And labels started to not only cut artists off of their roster that weren't producing enough revenue to, basically make it worthwhile to keep them under contract. The second thing, and the worst thing was, as they cut artists from their label, they weren't replacing them with an equal number of new artists. And that hurt studio revenue substantially. But the thing that really hit us the most happened around 2006. What happened in 2006 is probably had the most effect on the Nashville recording community. Anybody know?
Spotify.
I'm sorry?
Spotify.
No.
Pro Tools.
No, well, indirectly Pro Tools.
Home recording.
Home studios.
Oh, yeah.
Home studios cut into my overdub business by 75%.
Wow.
That's the impact of home studios. Now everybody can have a laptop, make a record, hypothetically. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but they can make records on them, and they have made records on them. But it's nothing like recording in a real studio. There's just something about a real studio. I remember back in the 90s, Tony Brown was VP at Universal, and he was recording everybody. I think he had something like 8 or 9 acts under his guidance, including Reba and the Oak Ridge Boys and George Strait and all that stuff. And he would book 2 or 3 studios on the same single day. And he couldn't be at all 3 places, so he'd go around, move around from one to the other. And I remember he was recording an artist at our studio. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't Straight, but he was recording an artist at our studio. And Pete Coleman, who was the engineer, was on the board, and the musicians were all out there recording. And Tony arrives, and he sticks his head in the door of the control room, and he listens, and he sees all the musicians into this music, cutting acts. And he looks over at Pete Coleman, and I'll never forget this. This is what he said. Pete, this is a real studio, isn't it? I said, my God, what have you been recording in? Of course it's a real studio. But what has really kept us alive, because, other than the technology, and other than my tenacity, as Larry would point out, and other than a few other components, is the great sonic quality of our studio. It can't be duplicated. I challenge people, if you're listening to SIX, Big 98, or you're listening to any country music station, and you hear, you listen for a half hour and you hear Urban and you hear Luke and you hear Miranda and you hear them all, and then all of a sudden an Al Dean record comes on. It's going to sound different. I guarantee you. It's going to sound different. The sonic quality of our studio is our success. It's why we haven't gone under. Come close, we haven't gone under. And that is when we were kicked out of the Phi-Sci building back in 1981. And we had a choice. We could have either sold off our equipment and gotten out of the business, which we'd been in less than a year. We could have found another spot and gone into a house on 17th, 18th, 19th Avenue. We could have gone into that house in Berrien, which we already owned. But we decided we wanted to do something a little bit different, a little bit off the mainstream. So we decided that we would shut down, and my brother, who was a merchant marine master mariner captain and was a certified financial planner when he was in port, when he was not at sea, put together a limited partnership of 8 individuals. We started a little company called Pro Audio Rentals, and we decided to build a studio from the ground up, which had not been done in a number of years. And we decided that we would do some research. Now remember, there's no internet, there's no Google, so we would go out and we'd go into vinyl. We'd go into our album collection, and I had thousands of albums, Dave had hundreds, and we would pull out the albums that we loved. Not only did we love the music, but we loved the sonic quality. What made these albums sound great? Albums like Days of Future Past, albums like Rubber Soul, albums like Sgt. Pepper, albums like Pet Sounds, which we'll get to in a moment, and Louis Newton-John, and I mean, great sounding, Alan Parsons Project. These were great sounding albums. And we decided to check out, well, what made those albums so great? And we found out that they had 2 components in common, 2 things in common. They were all recorded in large tracking rooms, and they were all recorded on either a Rupert Neve or a Trident console, which were both English desks, both English boards, both English consoles. Those were the 2 components. So we decided we're going to build a large tracking room, and we're going to get a Trident console, the first one in Nashville. Oh, the first, the Trident 80 in Nashville. There was a Trident A range, an old Trident, down in Bob Montgomery's studio in what became a bank in a place called Bennett House. Any of you remember Bennett House?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, in Franklin, right off the square. Well, they had an A range, which was an old Trident. We got the new version, the 80, and it was the first one in town. And we're now on to our 4th Trident console. We got an 80, then we got an 80B and 87, we got an 80C and 89, and then in 2001 we got an 85.1. So with automation, 48 channels, great console. Never forgotten how great Trident that console has been in our room. It's the perfect console for our studio. But when we did the research, we found out that these large tracking rooms had, a large surface area. They had high ceilings, but they also had the 2 other features that people don't know about unless you do the research, unless you're into it. One is called a floating floor. And that is that wherever there's an overdub room or a control room or a tracking area, it's a different cement pour. And there's a gap like so big with insulation in between. So the sound doesn't transfer from one floor to the other floor. So when you hit your drums, the kick drum in one part of the studio, it doesn't come up on the piano in the other part of the studio, or it doesn't come up in the control room, it doesn't come up in the guitar overdub room. And That was the secret, non-parallel walls. If you look, it's 42 by 30, which is a pretty big room, and it's got 24-foot ceilings. And if you look around where the wall hits the ceiling, there's no right angles. They were all mathematically calculated. And that was by design, that's the way we wanted. And it was funny, when we pretty much, we had a general contractor, a guy named Cassidy, who we fired about 3 months in when he started, coming in with higher cost, and crews weren't showing up because he'd taken on some new jobs and all that sort of stuff. So we canned him, and we ended up finishing it ourselves. And I remember we had hired they were all independent contractors, the electricians, the plumbers, the carpenters. They were, and we got bids, and we were real careful who we hired. We couldn't afford any overruns. And we had these two black gentlemen who were masonry guys, bricklayers, right? And we gave them the plans, the blueprints, and they go out on the backyard, what was the backyard, and they're out there about a half hour, and they come in, like with this stare on their face, and they're pointing to the blueprint, and they're saying, well, Mr. Vail, this is something weird here, but the wall's on straight. And I said, yeah, right, that's the idea. There are these weird angles. And I said, just follow the blueprints, we'll be okay. So they did. And they had these scaffoldings, and as they went up, as they put the walls up, 24, 25, 26 feet is a long way, they had scaffolding. And they were in their 50s or 60s, these two gentlemen, right? But they had what I call slaves, which is a horrible word, right? But they had younger guys, muscular guys, black guys, hustling up, with the bricks, and hustling up with the buckets of sand, because the construction blocks, the normal construction blocks, were filled at each level with sand. And we calculated that we filled those walls with 120 tons of sand.
Wow.
And it was all hand carried by their assistants.
Wow.
And they went up those ladders like there was nothing. I mean, it was a sight to see. I wish I had a phone camera back then. Do fast forward and ding, 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 and be it done.
Fred,
Yeah,
would it be possible to ask you to come back in August?
yeah, I can come back in August.
We would love to have you.
I'm just about done, but I'll,
Well,
do you have another 5 minutes, and I'll try to wrap it
you
up?
have another probably hour of stories to tell us.
Oh, yeah, well, there's a lot of war stories up here.
Well, that's the stuff that we never hear or read about, that we want to hear from you. But if you want to go on for 5 more minutes, we still want you to come back.
Yeah, okay, I can do that. That wouldn't be a problem. So, in Nashville initially, other than the Trafco studio and a few others, they were built in houses. That was the first Bradley Barn, the first studio on 16th was in a house. And Whalen had a studio in a house, and we had a lot of studios in houses, including Quadraphonic over on 18th. That was a studio in a house. And the problem with a home studio, or a studio in a house, which nowadays would be called a home studio, is the fact that the ceilings are much lower. They're 10, 12, maybe 14 feet. And they're parallel walls. They're all straight walls. And the problem with parallel walls is that sound travels until it hits the surface, and then it bounces. So if you were to put in a rectangular room, typical living room, where a tracking room might be built, might be retrofit into a living room, and maybe the control room is in what used to be the kitchen, and the drum cage is in what used to be the dining room, etc. But the problem is, when you hit the kick drum, it's going to go to the furthest surface, the wall, and it's going to hit that wall. And it's going to bounce back and hit the wall behind you. And then it's going to bounce and hit the far wall again. Then it's going to bounce back and hit the wall behind the drummer, and back and forth until it dissipates. With non-parallel walls, it's kind of like banging a shot on a billiard table. It deflects, it disperses, and that's where we get our sound. That's where we get the Treasure Isle sound. And it's worked like I said now, for 38 years. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the old saying. I mean, you can put new equipment in, but you don't monkey with the sound. And we also added a live echo chamber. But one of the things that has really made me upset in a way is that Nashville, the good news is Nashville's a growing town, considered one of the top cities in America to move to. All you gotta do is go down to Lower Broad and see all the bachelorette parties. Women come here from all over the South and Midwest to have their parties. The scooters, the golf carts, I mean, it's a mess. But it's great for Nashville that it can draw these people from all over the country and really all over the world. The bad news is the traffic, and the bad news is we've lost major studios. The Trafco studio where Elvis recorded Heartbreak Hotel is a parking lot behind Beaman. That's where they store all the cars they can't sell, where Elvis recorded Heartbreak Hotel in 1956. Paul McCartney, Linda McCartney, and Wings recorded Junior's Farm at the Sound Shop, 13th and Division. It's a high-rise condominium. It's gone. They almost tore down RCAA. An investor bought it and was going to tear it down. And another investor who was into the music and the history bought it from the first investor and saved it from the wrecking ball. So we kept RCAA, where Elvis recorded and Perry Como recorded and Waylon Jennings recorded. And Chris Stapleton is recording now his 2 or 3 Grammy-winning albums. So we've lost the Tulane Hotel is gone. It's a parking lot. That's where Hank Williams recorded. That's where those 3 engineers set up a little studio in the Tulane Hotel for Nashville's first dedicated studio in 1946, and it's gone. So in the name of progress, we're losing history.
We're gonna give you markers in their spots.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've been thinking of that for the last year or better. They need to try to, put a marker. Certainly where the Trafco studio was on McGavock, and certainly where Sound Shop was over on 13th and Division. They really need to do that. But before I go, a couple of key songs, and then I'll end. This song here was recorded at RCAB, and I want you guys to pay attention to this. This is a song written by the great Boudleaux Bryant, his wife Felice, to show you how times have changed. When I came to town, I first arrived here in 1974. I was getting ready to record a young artist named Jeannie Long from North Carolina. Not a songwriter, I needed songs. So I went out and started going to publishers looking for songs, right? And I go to the house of Bryant over on Belmont Avenue, and I go in, and it's late in the afternoon, and I tell the girl, I'm Fred Vail, I just came to town here, I'm getting ready to record a young girl, Jeannie Long from North Carolina. She's a terrific singer. I'm the former manager of the Beach Boys, just left RCA, and I'd like to hear some of your songs. And she said, well, it's pretty late in the afternoon, and just about that time, this gentleman sticks his head out the door and looks at me and says, Fred, he said, I'm Boudleaux Bryant. He said, I don't have any time this afternoon, but if you'd like to come out to our house at Old Hickory Lake tomorrow, I'll be glad to play you some songs. So Dave and I, my partner Dave Shipley at the time, he and I went out to Old Hickory to their home on the lake. And I never forget this as long as I live. They had a beautiful home, what they call open concept now. The living room, dining room, and great room were all together, one huge room. And Felice is over at the sink doing dishes from their meal. She's washing dishes. And Boudleaux has us take a seat on the sofa, and he's in this big easy chair with his guitar. And they're playing songs for me live. And whenever they came to the chorus, Felice would add her vocal, I'd hear harmony in stereo. Felice and Boudleaux Bryant. He wrote this song. This is the first record that I know of in the history of music that went #1 pop, #1 country, #1 R&B. A grand slam. And Felice and Boudleaux are your heroes. Because Felice and Grudlow came here from North Carolina, and they were the first songwriters to prove to the Music Row execs that you could actually make a living writing songs. That's who you have to thank, is Felice and Grudlow, who are rightfully in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and the Country Music Hall of Fame, and the National, and the NSAI Hall of Fame, the 2 Hall of Fame, 3 Hall of Fame. So that's a great milestone. Gone. My dear friend Ken Nelson, executive at Capitol Records, had an artist named Terry Preston, and they tried a record called Gone on Terry that didn't work. And right about that time, 1956, we were having an influx of rock and roll. Rock and roll was competing with country music for airplay and for record sales. So Ken, in his wisdom, decides he'll go into the studio, the Quonset hut, and they'll record the song again and put it out under Furlan Husky, and we'll get rid of the steel guitar, and we'll add strings, and we'll get rid of the duet harmonies, and we'll add a quartet with a high soprano, and we'll get rid of the fiddles, and we'll put in a full orchestra. And they recorded Go On, #1 record, and it was the first record to introduce America, the world, to what became known as the Nashville Sound. 3 country classics were recorded at the Quonset Hut, Columbia Studio. Holly Jolly Christmas, Burl Ives, standard. Jingle Bell Rock's Bobby Helms, standard. And of course, Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, how could I forget? Little Miss Dynamite, Brenda Lee. So, there we go. So I'll come back in August and we'll do part 2. In the meantime, I'll send you the link. Hopefully you'll be able to get it and open it. If you don't, then we'll hopefully have it figured out to be able to, hook it up to the computer here and somehow or another play it. It basically, I've been doing it now for 5 years. I've updated the video twice. It started out at about 10 minutes. I moved it to 14 minutes. Now it's 25 minutes. And then it's filled in with my narration, my live narration. But I salute over 30 studios, and I salute over 80 iconic recordings during that 25 minutes. Now, what you'll get when you get the link, you'll get photos of the studios, photos of the artists, and the music, the hook, the chorus. You won't get my narration, so that 25 minutes will go quick, like that.
I love the narration.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Greg, can we take a quick picture?
Sure.
Archives?
You may.
Enjoying the show?
This is my friend
That was
JJ.
awesome. I'm Melody.
And JJ's a great
I'm Brett.
writer.
Nice to meet you.
And,
Brett
I wanted
Woodruff.
him to film this because I've done it for Lipscomb and
Wait a minute.
all these different schools and narratives and all that, but I've never had it on tape.
Fred, come on, Fred.
So that's what we're doing.
We're going to squeeze the pretty girl.
Okay.
Sure.
Fred in the middle.